Hi everyone, my name is Miss Connolly. I started making videos for my 5th graders and this one is for them. But I wanted to share them with everybody so that everyone could be learning during this crazy time. So today for math time, we are going to be covering rounding decimals. Okay, so before we get into rounding decimals, I want to remind you what you already know about rounding whole numbers. All right, so let's look at the number 172. I'm going to have us round to the nearest 10, okay? So when we think about the nearest 10, we're going to be thinking about the tens place, so I always want you to identify which digit is in the place that we're rounding to, okay? So we're thinking about this here. There's a 7 in the tens place, so we know if we're counting by tens, we would be saying 160, 170, 180, 190. We want to think about which two groups of 10 is this in between, okay? So I know that 172 is between, I'm going to show you on a number line, it's between 170 and 180. So those are going to be my two choices that I have to round to. Now when we're thinking about rounding to the nearest 10, I'm really asking you which 10 is this closest to? Which group of 10, 170 or 180, is 172 closest to? Okay, so I hope you're thinking about that right now while I put something up. I want to show you that if we're thinking about directly halfway between 170 and 180, right in the middle would be 175. Okay, so anything 175 or higher, we are going to say is closer to 180 because it is. Anything 174 or lower is going to be closer to 170, okay? So that's something I always want you to think about is this number that's halfway between the two numbers you're rounding to, and then compare your number to it. So would 172 fall on this side of 175, or would 172 fall on this side of 175? And clearly you know the answer, so I'm just going to show you. 172 would fall over here, which is closer to 170, and so we would round down. And when I say round down, that doesn't mean go below 170. You round to 170 and stop, okay? Important to know, another explanation, which is exactly what we want you thinking about, is some students would say in class, and I loved it, that 172 is only 2 wholes away from 170. Okay, so we would just have to count 71, 72, so 2 away. And 172 is 8 away from 180, which means that it is further away from 180 because it's 8 away, and it's only 2 away from 170, so it's definitely closer to 170, so we would round to 170. Okay, so that's just a quick review of you rounding whole numbers. And now I want to show you how we're going to use what we know about rounding whole numbers to round into the tenths, hundredths, tens and hundredths place, and we're also going to round to the nearest whole, the nearest 1. Okay, so let's get this erased. We're going to still be using the number line. We're still going to think which two numbers is it in between, which one's it closer to. We're going to take the same process. It's just going to look a little different because we're rounding with decimals. Okay, so we're going to start by rounding to the nearest tenth. All right, the nearest tenth. So let's start with the number 1 and 83 hundredths. So it goes to the hundredths place. So that's why I'm going to say 83 hundredths. And I want to know which tenth is it closest to. Okay, so we want to, first we have to think which tenths is it in between. So if I was counting by tenths, I'm trying to make it so you guys can hear me say the TH. We would count 1 and 1 tenth, 1 and 2 tenths, 1 and 3 tenths, 1 and 4 tenths, 1 and 5 tenths, 1 and 6 tenths, 1 and 7 tenths, 1 and 8 tenths, 1 and 9 tenths, and then we'd be at the number 2 wholes, 2 and 0 tenths. Okay, so when we think about which 2 tenths is this in between, this is in between 1 and 8 tenths and 1 and 9 tenths. Something else that I want you to think about is equivalent decimals. You know how to write a number 1 and 8 tenths that goes to the tenths place, you know how to write it as an equivalent decimal in hundredths. Okay, so when we're thinking about how much is 1 8/10 with hundredths, it would be 1 80 hundredths. Okay, so that's going to help you a lot with this rounding to think about this as hundredths. Which 2 hundredths is it in between? Or what 2 tenths is it in between? But if you write it as hundredths, you can use what we just went over. Okay, so since I know that this is between 1 8/10 and 1 9/10, but I'm going to use what I know about equivalent decimals to figure this out. So I'm going to put this between 1 80 hundredths and 1 90 hundredths because I'm thinking about 1 83 hundredths. So then I think about what we just did with whole numbers. What number would come right smack in the middle there? And it would be, what's between 80 hundredths and 90 hundredths? 1 85 hundredths. Okay, so then we think about, where would 1 83 hundredths fall on this number line? Would it be closer to 1 80 hundredths? Or would it be closer to 1 90 hundredths? So think about that for a second. 1 83 hundredths, would it be closer to 1 80 hundredths? Would it fall on this side? Or would it be closer to 1 90 hundredths? Okay, so I'm going to put 1 83 hundredths on the number line where it would approximately belong. And we see that 1 83 hundredths is on this side of 1 85 hundredths. It's less than 1 85 hundredths, so it's closer to 1 80 hundredths. Some students might have been thinking about this in their head and saying this is 3 hundredths away from 1 80 hundredths, which is equivalent to 1 8/10. And it's 7 hundredths away from making 1 90 hundredths. So you might have been thinking that's closer to 1 80 hundredths. So this is what we're closer to. But I'm saying you have to round to the nearest tenth. That means that you are going to be writing your answer to the tenths place. So even though this says 1 80 hundredths, you want to write 1 8/10 because we're ending at the tenths place where they told us to round to. So 1 8/10. This is equivalent, but I just want you getting in the habit, if they say round to the nearest tenth, that you write it to the tenth. Okay? So we are going to use the equivalent decimal to help us. We are going to be writing, if I say round to the nearest tenth, we're going to be writing it to the tenths place. So we have to have this ability to go from tenths to hundredths, hundredths to tenths, and know our equivalencies really well. Okay, so let's try another one, and we're going to stick with rounding to the nearest tenth. Okay, so this is where we're rounding to still, and let's get started on another one. So let's think about if we have 2 38 hundredths. Okay, so 2 38 hundredths. And this is where knowing how to represent our decimals on that number line is going to be so important during this. So you did a good job in class. Let's keep it up. So now we need to think, which 2 tenths is this in between? And we can think about that like we did the last one. We can think about 30 hundredths. So 2 3/10, which is the same as 2 30 hundredths. Or we also know, or this is also between, so it's in between 2 30 hundredths, and we know the next tenth would be 4/10. 2 3/10, the next tenth would be 2 4/10. So I can write my equivalent decimal as 2 40 hundredths. So how did I decide this? You can count by tenths. You can say, if I'm saying 2 3/10, just ignore that for a second. We're thinking about the tenths place. 2 3/10, 2 4/10. Okay, so when you make your number line, you would be thinking about, oh, this is between 2 3/10 and 2 4/10. And then you could say, which one would this be closer to? And I just like to think about it like this. I like to think about it as hundredths because my decimals were into the hundredths place right now. Okay, so when we think about what's halfway in between, you can even think about it here as 30 and 40. What would be halfway? You know, 35. So 2 and 35 hundredths would be halfway. Use anything that you know about whole numbers to help you figure this out. All right, so how do we round to the nearest tenth? We think about 2 and 38 hundredths. Is it closer to 2 and 30 hundredths, or is it closer to 2 and 40 hundredths? So is it closer to 2 and 3 tenths, because that's equivalent, or is it closer to 2 and 4 tenths? And when we think about 2 and 38 hundredths, I know that that would go approximately right here on the number line after the halfway mark of 2 and 35 hundredths. So when I think about which one is it closer to, 2 and 38 hundredths is closer to 2 and 40 hundredths because it's only 2 hundredths away. 2 hundredths from here to here. And it's 8 hundredths away from 2 and 30 hundredths. So when I think about rounding, I know I'm going to select this one. I know I have to write it to the tenths place. So what is 2 and 40 hundredths written as tenths? 2 and 4 tenths. So it's closest to there because it's only 2 hundredths away from making the next group of tenths, and it's 8 away from here. Okay? So that's how we're going to round here. And this is my email at the top, friends who aren't in my class. If you have any questions, make sure you send them. All right, so we're going to go to the hundredths place next, right here. I'll probably just do 2 examples so the video doesn't get too long on you. So let's think about rounding to the nearest hundredth. So when we think about that, I'm going to throw some 5s in here because that's always a fun number to round with. Let's read the decimal first. 2 and 455 thousandths, okay? And we are going to be rounding to the hundredths place, okay? So I underlined the digit in the hundredths place. You have your place value chart here to help you. Okay, so we have to think about which 2 hundredths is it in between, okay? So sometimes when I see thousands, I just get confused. So I'm going to cover this up for a second, and I know that this is between 2 and 45 hundredths, and then what would the next hundredth be? 2 and 45 hundredths, 2 and 46 hundredths. Okay, so when you're thinking about which 2 hundredths is in between, because you've got to think about what to choose from, you need to decide. So I cover up the thousands place in my head, or do it in your head, and you say it's between 245 hundredths or 246 hundredths. Okay, so let's write that down on our number line. Oops, crooked number line. 2 and 45 hundredths or 2 and 46 hundredths. And we need to think about which is this closest to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an equivalent decimal because I am working into the thousands place up here, and it makes more sense to me right now to think about this as thousands. So I have 2 and 450 thousandths and 2 and 460 thousandths. I want to think about which one is this closest to. All right, so just like always, we're going to go right in the middle and think about what's halfway in between. When I do this in my head, I like to think about whole numbers because whole numbers help us solve with decimals. So I'm going to think about what is halfway between what is halfway between 450 and 460. And you know, it's 455. Don't forget that we're thinking about 2 and 455 thousandths, but I used whole numbers to help me when I'm thinking about what's halfway. And do you notice something? I think you do notice something. The number that we're rounding is exactly halfway between 2 and 450 thousandths and 2 and 460 thousandths. So can we say which one it is closest to? It is 5 away from here, and sorry, not 5. It is 5 thousandths away from 2 and 450 thousandths, and it is 5 thousandths away from 2 and 460 thousandths. So if it is perfectly halfway, what do we do? Well, I'm going to tell you. The math rule is that when it is exactly halfway and higher, then we are going to round up, okay? So if you find yourself in a situation where you have a 5 in the next place value, and you've decided, oh my goodness, that is the exact same distance, it's always going to be a 5. Anyways, it's the exact same distance from the number we could round down to and the number we could round up to. You are always going to round up, okay? So we are going to round up. So it is closer to 2 and 460 thousandths. However, since we're rounding to the hundredths place, we write it to the hundredths place. And putting the star here and telling yourself to pump the brakes right there when you're writing your final answer, that could be helpful. Just a hint, okay? So we're gonna write 2 and 46 hundredths, and I know to stop here because I'm asking myself to round to the nearest hundredth, okay? 2 and 46 hundredths is equivalent to 2 and 460 thousandths, so that's okay. Okay, so what did we do? We thought about which hundredth these two are in between, and we counted just by hundredths, 245 hundredths, the next thing would be 246 hundredths. We wrote both of those down as hundredths, and then I said, and we are going to say from now on, it might be easy for me to think about this if I think about equivalents in thousandths, and then we decided halfway and went from there. Okay, so we're going to do one more to the hundredths place, and then we're going to do a couple to the ones, and then you're going to try some on your own. All right, so let's look at rounding to the nearest hundred, 1 and 42 thousandths. I'm just feeling quite tricky today. All right, so 1 and 42 thousandths. I want to think which hundredths is this in between. So I'm going to think about the hundredths place, identify what digits in the hundredths place, and I'm going to say that this number is somewhere between 1 and 4 hundredths. And what would the next hundredth be? 1 and 5 hundredths. Okay, so I have those to choose from. 1 and 4 hundredths, 1 and 5 hundredths. Okay, now this number goes to the thousandths place, so sometimes it's helpful to, when we're deciding what to round to match which place value we're going to, by making an equivalent decimal. So 1 and 40 thousandths is my equivalent decimal, and 1 and 50 thousandths is my equivalent decimal down there. Okay, so when we think about that, then it makes it easier for us to think about what this might be closer to. Okay, obviously there's other strategies. You might be using an area model, things like that, but I couldn't get that on this board. Okay, so let's think about what's halfway between. I'm going to think about it as a whole number. Between 40 and 50. Halfway between 40 and 50. 45. 1 and 45 hundredths. Okay, and you might be noticing something that's always happening with the last digit when I say halfway between. I hope you're noticing. If you're not, go back, rewind, think about it. So anyways, I'm going to think about where would 1 in 42 thousandths fall? Is it closer to 1 in 40 thousandths, or is it closer to 1 in 50 thousandths? And I use my halfway mark to help me think about it. And I know that it's less than 1 in 45 thousandths, so anything on this side would make us round down, okay? Because 1 in 42 thousandths would be somewhere around here. So it's closer to 1 in 40 thousandths. It's only 2 thousandths away from here. It's 8 thousandths away from here. So we're going to write it to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so let me put my star up here, star down here, wherever you want to put your star so you know where to stop. Make sure you stop when you're writing your final answer in the correct place value. Okay, we're thinking about equivalents. So 1 in 40 thousandths, I want to write to the hundredths place, 1 and 4 hundredths. That is the nearest hundredth. Okay, last ones. We are going to think about rounding to the nearest whole number, which is our nearest one. So my star is going here. All right? So, last two examples. Let's think about 2 and 93 hundredths. And we are thinking about the ones place. So I'm going to underline that digit to help me think about it. And I'm going to say to myself, what two ones is this in between? So when I'm counting by ones, this is in between the number, the whole number. We're thinking about whole numbers now, kind of funky to go back to that. This is in between the number 2. Okay, think about it like money, 2 and 93 cents. Okay, $2.93. That is somewhere between 2 whole dollars and 3 whole dollars. Okay, so it's somewhere between 2 whole dollars and 3 whole dollars. And what would be halfway between 2 whole dollars and 3 whole dollars? It would be $2.50. So 2 and 50 hundredths would be our halfway between 2 wholes and 3 wholes, okay? This also 2 and 5 tenths, 2 and a half. That's how we think about where we are here. All right, so when we think about 2 and 93 hundredths, is it closer to 3 wholes, $3, or is it closer to 2 wholes and $2? Okay, think about it like money just for now because I wrote it to the hundredths place. So anyways, if we were going to put $2.93, 2 and 93 hundredths on our number line, it would probably be even closer to that. And then we say to ourselves, it's definitely rounding up to the whole number 3 because it's only 7 hundredths away from the number 3, and it's 93 hundredths away from the number 2. Okay, so we clearly see it's closer here. We also can think about our halfway mark. Is it greater than halfway? And 2 in 93 hundredths is definitely greater than 2 in 50 hundredths. Okay, so we're rounding up. We're writing it to the ones place. So my star is here. I'm going to put it up higher so I can write it. So I'm going to write the nearest whole number, the nearest one, and stop. It is closest to the whole number 3. So that's where we write it. Okay? So rounding to nearest ones, you kind of get to breathe for a second because it feels a little more familiar. All right, so last example, then I'm going to give you some to try on your own. All right, so let's think about rounding to we have 6 and 49 hundredths. I'm going to think about which 2 whole numbers is it in between. It is, and I can cover this up and count by wholes. It's between 6, and then the next whole would be 7. So 6 ones or 7 ones. So we have 6, and we have 7. And when I think about what is halfway between 6 and 7, we can think about 6 and 5 tenths, or 6 and 50 hundredths would be halfway between 6 and 7. I went to the hundredths place again here because this is in the hundredths place, and I kind of like to make the equivalent decimal match what I'm working with up here, so comparisons can be really easy. If I was putting 6 and 49 hundredths on the number line, it would be right below 6 and 50 hundredths. So I know that I'm rounding down because it is closer to 6 ones. It is only 49 hundredths away from here, and it's 51 hundredths away from here. Okay, so when I'm writing what is the nearest one, I stop there. It's closest to 6. You do not need to do this. You just need to write the 6. Okay, so I want you to get in the habit of whatever place value they're asking you to round to when we're thinking about this. You rounds there. Okay, and write it that way. So I'm going to give you some problems to round on your own. What you're going to do is you are going to round each one. Round each to the nearest 1, to the nearest 10, and to the nearest 100. Okay, so each example I'm going to give you, you're going to round to the nearest 1, the nearest tenth, and the nearest hundredth. Okay, so I'm going to give you the same number. You practice rounding to the nearest 1, then the nearest tenth, then the nearest hundredth, and you try the other examples, okay? So let's try rounding. Well, you're going to try it on your own at home. Round that one to the nearest 1, to the nearest tenth, and then to the nearest hundredth. Okay, then I'll give you a couple more. Round that one to the nearest 1, then round this to the nearest tenth, then round this to the nearest hundredth, and the last one. Practice rounding to the nearest 1, the nearest tenth, and the nearest hundredth. And if you want additional practice, have your parents write down some numbers and practice rounding, okay? Write down your place value chart, use the stars to help you, and I want you thinking about equivalent decimals when you're doing the rounding on the number line. That'll help you too, okay? Bye.